On the evening of May 25th, 1951, at approximately 9:47 p.m., a ferry departed from Southampton, England, bound for Saint-Malo, France. Among the passengers were two men traveling together under the names Roger Stiles and David Robertson. They carried minimal luggage, a single suitcase each, and had purchased their tickets with cash earlier that afternoon. The ferry's manifest listed them as British tourists planning a brief holiday in France. The evening was cool and overcast, with light rain beginning to fall as the vessel pulled away from the dock. One of the men stood at the railing for several minutes, looking back at the receding lights of the English coast, before retreating inside to the passenger cabin where his companion had already settled with a newspaper and a flask. In reality, the two men were Donald Duart Maclean, a 38-year-old British diplomat who had served in some of the Foreign Office's most sensitive positions, and Guy Francis de Moncey Burgess, a 40-year-old Foreign Office official and BBC producer. By the time British authorities realized they had vanished, both men would be in Moscow, beyond the reach of prosecution, having completed one of the most damaging defections in the history of British intelligence. Before we continue with Donald Maclean's story, if you're interested in the hidden history of Cold War espionage and the real human cost of intelligence operations, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these documented cases every week. Now, let's examine how a privileged British diplomat became one of the Soviet Union's most valuable spies. Donald Maclean had been born on May 25, 1913. His 38th birthday was the day he chose to flee England, in Marylebone, London, to a family of considerable social standing and political prominence. His father, Sir Donald Maclean, was a Liberal Member of Parliament who served in various cabinet positions and was known for his strict Presbyterian moral code and dedication to public service. His mother, Gwendolen, came from a wealthy family and maintained a household that emphasized education, propriety, and service to the nation. Donald was the fourth of 5 children, raised in an environment where intellectual achievement and moral rectitude were expected as a matter of course. From an early age, Donald displayed the academic brilliance that would later open doors throughout his career. He attended Gresham's School in Norfolk, an institution known for producing scholars and civil servants, where he excelled in languages and literature. Teachers noted his exceptional memory, his facility with French and German, and his somewhat reserved, serious demeanor. Unlike many boys his age, Donald showed little interest in athletics or social activities, preferring to spend time reading history and political philosophy. One schoolmaster wrote in a report that young Donald possessed a mind that absorbs information like blotting paper absorbs ink, comprehensive and permanent. In 1931, at age 18, Donald won a scholarship to Trinity Hall, Cambridge University, to study modern languages. Cambridge in the early 1930s was an intellectual crucible where privileged young men from public schools encountered radical political ideas amid the Great Depression's devastation and the rise of fascism across Europe. The traditional political establishment seemed incapable of addressing mass unemployment and poverty. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were ascending to power with an explicitly anti-communist, anti-Semitic platform that threatened the continent. Donald joined the Cambridge University Socialist Society during his first year and attended meetings regularly, participating in heated debates about capitalism's failures and communism's promises. He read Marx, Lenin, and other communist theorists with the same intensity he brought to his language studies. He developed close friendships with other students who questioned the values they had inherited. Guy Burgess, whom he met in 1932, and later Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. These men would eventually be identified as the Cambridge Five, a Soviet intelligence network that penetrated the highest levels of British government. The recruitment came in 1934, during Donald's final year at Cambridge. The recruiter was almost certainly Arnold Deutsch, an Austrian communist and NKVD intelligence officer who operated in Britain under various covers. Deutsch was skilled at approaching idealistic young men from privileged backgrounds who felt guilt about their class position and were horrified by fascism. He did not appeal to mercenary motives or present espionage as adventure. Instead, according to declassified Soviet intelligence files, he framed recruitment as an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the fight against fascism and to support the only political system that offered genuine hope for humanity's future. Donald agreed to work for Soviet intelligence. According to his own statements made decades later in Moscow, he believed at the time that he was making a moral choice, that the Soviet Union represented the progressive forces of history and that providing information to Soviet intelligence was a form of anti-fascist resistance. He did not see himself as betraying Britain, but rather as serving a higher loyalty to international socialism. After graduating from Cambridge in 1934 with first-class honors in modern languages, Donald entered the civil service examinations, the competitive process through which the British government recruited personnel for the Foreign Office, the Treasury, and other departments. He performed exceptionally well on both the written examinations and the interviews. His examiners saw a young man with impeccable family credentials, outstanding academic achievements, and the serious, thoughtful demeanor appropriate for diplomatic service. In autumn 1935, the Foreign Office offered him a position. His security vetting raised no concerns. The concept that a man from Sir Donald Maclean's family might be a communist spy was simply inconceivable to the investigators. Donald's first posting was to the Foreign Office in London, where he worked in the Western Department handling correspondence related to France and the League of Nations. The work was relatively routine, drafting memos, preparing briefing papers, attending meetings, but it provided him with access to classified diplomatic cables and policy documents. Soviet intelligence was not particularly interested in routine Foreign Office paperwork at this stage, but Donald's position represented a long-term investment. He was being placed within the British foreign policy establishment with the expectation that he would rise through the ranks and eventually access genuinely sensitive material. In March 1938, Donald married Melinda Marling, an American woman from a wealthy Chicago family whom he had met in Paris the previous year. Melinda, 21 years old at the time of their marriage, came from a background similar to Donald's in terms of class and education. She had attended boarding schools and finishing schools in Europe, spoke fluent French, and moved comfortably in diplomatic circles. The wedding took place at the British consulate in Paris, followed by a small reception at a restaurant on the left bank. Melinda wore a cream-colored suit and carried white roses. Donald wore a dark suit and appeared, according to wedding photographs, serious and somewhat nervous. By all accounts, their marriage began happily. Melinda had no knowledge of Donald's recruitment by Soviet intelligence, and Donald maintained strict separation between his personal life and his espionage activities. In October 1938, Donald received his first overseas posting to the British Embassy in Paris as Third Secretary. Paris, in late 1938, was the center of European diplomatic activity as the continent moved closer to war. The Munich Agreement had just been signed, temporarily satisfying Hitler's demands regarding Czechoslovakia, but doing nothing to address Nazi Germany's fundamental expansionist aims. Donald's work involved monitoring French politics, attending diplomatic receptions, and reporting on French government attitudes toward the growing German threat. It was in Paris that Donald began actively providing classified information to Soviet intelligence. His handler was a Soviet intelligence officer operating in Paris under diplomatic cover. The meetings occurred approximately once every 2 to 3 weeks, typically in cafes or parks where the encounters could appear casual to any observer. Donald prepared handwritten summaries of Foreign Office telegrams and memoranda, occasionally photographing documents using a small Minox camera provided by his handlers. The information he provided included British assessments of French military preparedness, British diplomatic strategy regarding Germany, and internal Foreign Office discussions about how to respond to Hitler's aggression. The value of Donald's intelligence increased dramatically with the outbreak of World War II in September 1939. In June 1940, after the fall of France to German forces, Donald was evacuated back to London along with other embassy staff. The Foreign Office assigned him to the General Department, which coordinated intelligence from various sources and prepared assessments for the War Cabinet. His desk was located in the main Foreign Office building on King Charles Street, in a room with tall windows overlooking St. James's Park. He worked long hours, often arriving before 8 in the morning and leaving after 7 in the evening. During the war years, from 1940 to 1944, Donald had access to some of the most sensitive intelligence in the British government. He saw decrypted German communications produced by the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. He read intelligence reports from MI6 agents operating in occupied Europe. He attended meetings where British strategic planning was discussed. He had access to correspondence between Churchill and Roosevelt. All of this information, or summaries of it, was passed to Soviet intelligence through a combination of dead drops, brief meetings, and photographed documents. The moral framework within which Donald understood his espionage shifted somewhat during the war years. Britain and the Soviet Union were allies against Nazi Germany, fighting together against what both nations characterized as existential threats to civilization. Donald rationalized his activities as contributing to Allied cooperation by ensuring that the Soviet Union had access to information that would help coordinate strategy and prevent German deception. He told himself that he was not betraying Britain, but rather ensuring that allies worked together effectively against a common enemy. In May 1944, Donald received the posting that would prove most significant in terms of intelligence value: assignment to the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. as First Secretary. More crucially, he was designated as the British representative to the Combined Policy Committee on Atomic Energy, a position that gave him access to classified information about the Manhattan Project and the Anglo-American development of atomic weapons. Donald arrived in Washington in June 1944 with Melinda, who was pregnant with their first child. They rented a house in Georgetown, a fashionable neighborhood of brick townhouses and tree-lined streets near the Potomac River. Their son Burgess was born in 1944. A second son, Donald Jr., was born in June 1946. Melinda managed the household, attended diplomatic functions, and raised the children while Donald worked 12-hour days at the embassy and attended evening receptions. Donald's work brought him into regular contact with American officials involved in atomic energy policy and with British scientists working on the Manhattan Project. He attended meetings at the Pentagon where the future of atomic weapons was discussed. He received technical briefings on uranium enrichment processes and plutonium production. He read strategic assessments about atomic bomb stockpiles and planning documents regarding potential use of atomic weapons. Between 1944 and 1948, Donald provided Soviet intelligence with information that significantly advanced Soviet atomic weapons development. According to declassified Soviet intelligence files and statements from former Soviet officials made after the Cold War ended, Donald's reporting included technical details about gaseous diffusion processes for enriching uranium, information about plutonium production reactors at Hanford, Washington, estimates of American atomic bomb stockpiles, and strategic planning documents regarding potential use of atomic weapons against the Soviet Union. Intelligence historians generally agree that espionage from multiple sources, including Donald, Klaus Fuchs, and others, shortened the timeline for Soviet atomic weapons development by months or potentially years. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, much earlier than American intelligence had predicted. While Soviet scientists would eventually have developed atomic weapons independently, information from espionage sources allowed them to avoid certain technical dead ends and to focus resources on approaches that the Americans and British had already proven viable. During his Washington posting, signs of strain began appearing in Donald's personal life. He drank heavily, Scotch primarily, consumed at diplomatic receptions, and increasingly at home in the evenings after Melinda and the children had gone to bed. According to later accounts from colleagues, he could be charming and gregarious at social events, particularly after several drinks, displaying wit and knowledge about art and literature. But he also had a tendency toward moody silences and occasional outbursts of temper that seemed disproportionate to their triggers. Melinda, managing a household with 2 small children while her husband worked constantly and came home smelling of alcohol, appeared increasingly isolated and unhappy. However, she maintained the appearance of a conventional diplomatic wife, and there is no evidence in any declassified files or later testimony that she suspected her husband's espionage during the Washington years. In August 1948, Donald's Washington posting ended. The Foreign Office recalled him to London to serve as head of the American Department, a position that gave him access to all telegraphic correspondence between the Foreign Office and British embassies throughout North and South America. He also saw high-level policy papers about Anglo-American relations, NATO planning, and Western strategy regarding the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. The family moved into a flat in Mayfair, and Donald began commuting to the Foreign Office on King Charles Street each morning. The year 1948 marked the beginning of the end for Donald, though he did not know it yet. In September 1945, a Soviet intelligence officer named Igor Guzenko had defected from the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, Canada, bringing documents that exposed a Soviet espionage network operating in Canada. Guzenko's defection led to arrests and investigations, though it did not immediately compromise Donald because Guzenko had no direct knowledge of Soviet operations in Britain or the United States. More significant was the American-British Signals Intelligence Program, codenamed Venona, which was working to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications from the 1940s. The decryption work was painstaking and slow, requiring cryptanalysts to work with fragmentary, heavily encrypted messages. By 1948, however, analysts were beginning to produce readable text from wartime Soviet cables. Some of these cables contained references to a Soviet source codenamed Homer, who was described as working in the British Embassy in Washington and having access to atomic energy information. MI5, Britain's domestic counterintelligence service, began a secret investigation to identify Homer. A small team of officers compiled a list of Foreign Office personnel who had been posted to Washington during the relevant period and who had access to atomic energy intelligence. Donald Maclean was on this list, along with several other diplomats. The investigation proceeded slowly because MI5 could not interrogate everyone on the list without risking compromise of the Venona program, which was among the most closely guarded secrets in British and American intelligence. In mid-1950, the Foreign Office posted Donald to Cairo as counselor and head of chancery at the British Embassy in Egypt. Cairo was considered a prestigious posting, but it also removed Donald from direct access to the most sensitive intelligence flowing through London. Whether this posting was influenced by nascent suspicions is unclear from available declassified records. In Cairo, Donald's deterioration accelerated. The heat was oppressive during summer months, reaching well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The diplomatic community was small and insular. Donald drank more heavily and more openly than he had in Washington or London. His hands trembled in the mornings. His face became flushed and puffy. Embassy staff noticed that he often smelled of alcohol even during working hours. In May 1950, less than a year after arriving in Cairo, Donald experienced what witnesses later described as a complete breakdown. It occurred on a Tuesday evening around 11 o'clock at night. Donald appeared at the apartment of a colleague, a junior diplomat, whose name was later redacted from official reports, without warning. He was drunk, disheveled, his tie loosened, and his shirt partially untucked. When the colleague opened the door, Donald pushed past him into the apartment and began speaking in a rapid, disjointed manner about betrayal, secrets, and the impossibility of living with what he knew. The colleague, alarmed by Donald's condition and confused by his rambling statements, tried to calm him and offered coffee. Donald refused, pacing around the small living room and gesturing dramatically. At one point, according to the colleague's later report to embassy security officials, Donald said something about how everything he had done was for nothing, how the cause he believed in was corrupt, how he had destroyed his life for a lie. The statements were fragmented and unclear, and the colleague did not immediately understand their significance. He interpreted Donald's breakdown as work-related stress combined with excessive drinking. After approximately 30 minutes of this behavior, Donald suddenly became quiet, sat down heavily on the sofa, and began to weep. The colleague contacted the embassy's senior administrative officer, who arrived within the hour and helped transport Donald back to his own residence. The following morning, embassy officials contacted London to report that Donald Maclean was experiencing a severe nervous crisis and was unfit for duty. Melinda, who was 7 months pregnant with their third child at the time of the breakdown, was devastated and bewildered. She had known Donald was drinking heavily, but had attributed it to work stress and the difficult climate. The breakdown forced her to confront the possibility that something deeper was wrong, though she still had no inkling of his espionage. Their daughter, also named Melinda, was born in Cairo in December 1950 during the period when Donald was on medical leave. Medical records from this period have not been fully declassified, but later accounts suggest that Donald's breakdown involved both alcoholism and severe anxiety, possibly related to the psychological burden of maintaining his double life for 15 years. He was sent back to London in late 1950 for what was officially described as treatment for nervous exhaustion and was placed on medical leave for several months. In March 1951, after being evaluated by Foreign Office medical personnel and psychiatrists, Donald was cleared to return to active duty. The Foreign Office assigned him to a position in London as head of the American Department's General Division, a significant role that gave him access to classified information about Anglo-American relations, though perhaps less sensitive than his previous postings. The decision to return him to a position with security clearance suggests that senior Foreign Office officials did not suspect espionage, attributing his Cairo breakdown to overwork, the difficult climate, and personal stress. What Donald did not know was that the MI5 investigation into the identity of Homer had continued throughout his medical leave and had now focused on him as the primary suspect. By early May 1951, MI5 had narrowed the list of possibilities to just a few individuals based on the Venona decrypts, and Donald was at the top. The case remained circumstantial, based on his posting history, his access to atomic information, and the timeline described in the Soviet cables. But MI5 officers believed they had identified the right man. Plans were being made to conduct formal interrogation of Donald in early June after additional evidence could be gathered. The person who warned Donald that he was under investigation was Kim Philby, another member of the Cambridge spy ring who had risen to become a senior officer in MI6 and who was serving in Washington as the British intelligence liaison. Philby learned about the investigation into Donald through his official access to counterintelligence information shared between MI5 and MI6. In early May 1951, Philby sent a coded message through Soviet intelligence channels warning that Homer had been identified and that arrest was imminent. Soviet intelligence made the decision to exfiltrate Donald to Moscow rather than risk his arrest and interrogation, which could lead to exposure of the entire Cambridge network. The plan involved using Guy Burgess, who was conveniently returning to London from Washington after a series of drunken incidents and traffic violations had made him a diplomatic embarrassment. Burgess would arrange Donald's escape and travel with him to ensure he reached Moscow safely. Guy Burgess arrived in London on May 7, 1951. Over the following 2.5 weeks, he worked with Soviet intelligence handlers to prepare the escape plan. The decision was made to use the ferry route from Southampton to Saint-Malo as the first leg of the journey, followed by travel across France to Switzerland, then to Austria, and finally into Czechoslovakia, where Soviet intelligence could safely transport them to Moscow. On the afternoon of Friday, May 25, 1951, Donald's 38th birthday, the plan was executed. Donald left his Foreign Office desk at approximately 5:30 p.m., telling colleagues he was heading home for a birthday dinner with his family. He took the Underground to Mayfair and arrived at the flat where Melinda had prepared a small celebration. Their 3 children were there: Burgess, age 6, Donald Jr., age 4, and baby Melinda, just 5 months old. According to Melinda's later accounts, she had baked a cake and prepared Donald's favorite meal, roast chicken with potatoes. The children sang "Happy Birthday." Donald seemed distracted and anxious throughout dinner, barely touching his food and drinking scotch instead. At approximately 7:45 p.m., Donald told Melinda that he needed to go out briefly to meet a colleague about an urgent work matter and that he would return later that evening. Melinda, accustomed to Donald's unpredictable work schedule, accepted the explanation without question. Donald kissed her on the cheek, touched each of his children on the head as if in benediction, and walked out of the flat carrying only his briefcase. Donald met Guy Burgess at a prearranged location near Marble Arch. Burgess had rented a car earlier that week using a false name. The 2 men drove southwest toward Southampton, approximately 80 miles from London, arriving at the port around 9:15 p.m. They purchased tickets for the overnight ferry to Saint-Malo under the names Roger Stiles and David Robertson, paying in cash. They carried minimal luggage, 1 small suitcase each containing a few changes of clothing and basic necessities. They boarded the ferry at approximately 9:30 p.m. The vessel departed at 9:47 p.m. When Donald failed to return home that night, Melinda was not immediately alarmed. She assumed he had stayed late with colleagues and would return the following morning. When he had not returned by Saturday afternoon, she began to worry. She telephoned the Foreign Office, but it was the weekend, and no one could provide information about Donald's whereabouts. By Sunday, May 27th, when Donald still had not returned and had not contacted her, Melinda reported him as missing to the police. The Foreign Office initially assumed Donald had suffered another breakdown and had perhaps wandered off confused or had possibly harmed himself. However, when investigators learned that Guy Burgess was also missing and that both men had last been seen on Friday evening, suspicions began to emerge. On Monday, May 28th, the Foreign Office contacted MI5, and MI5 officers who had been investigating Donald immediately understood what had likely occurred. British and French authorities were alerted to search for Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess. By this time, however, the two men were already deep into France, traveling by train from Saint-Malo toward Switzerland. From Switzerland, they crossed into Austria, and from Austria, they were taken into Czechoslovakia by Soviet intelligence officers who had been positioned to assist. From Prague, they were transported by train to Moscow, arriving on or around June 1st, 1951. The British government did not publicly acknowledge the disappearance of the two diplomats until June 7, 1951, nearly 2 weeks after they had vanished. The initial public statement described them as missing and said that authorities were investigating their whereabouts. Only gradually, over the following weeks and months, did the government acknowledge the likelihood that they had defected to the Soviet Union. The security crisis within the British Foreign Office and intelligence services was immediate and profound. If Donald and Burgess had been Soviet spies, then every piece of classified information they had accessed over their careers was potentially compromised. Investigators worked backward through years of documents, trying to assess damage. The investigation eventually concluded that Donald had likely provided Soviet intelligence with information on thousands of classified documents over a 16-year period, including intelligence related to atomic weapons, NATO planning, British diplomatic strategy, and Anglo-American relations. For Melinda Maclean, the disappearance was catastrophic. She insisted initially that Donald would never have defected and that there must be another explanation. She believed he had suffered a breakdown and had perhaps lost his memory or was being held against his will. When MI5 officers questioned her in the days and weeks following the disappearance, she appeared genuinely shocked and confused. The interrogations were conducted in her Mayfair flat, with her 3 young children in the next room. Officers asked her detailed questions about Donald's friends, his activities, his political beliefs, any unusual behavior she had noticed. Melinda answered as best she could, but maintained that she had no knowledge of espionage. The Foreign Office provided Melinda with a small pension and some financial support, but her social position became increasingly awkward and isolated. Friends and acquaintances did not know how to relate to her. Some believed she must have known about Donald's espionage and were cold and suspicious. Others pitied her as an innocent victim, but found the situation too uncomfortable to maintain close friendship. Reporters called the flat constantly until Melinda disconnected the telephone. Photographers waited outside the building, hoping to capture images of the abandoned wife and children of the traitor diplomat. The 3 Maclean children were too young to understand what had happened. Burgess, at age 6, asked repeatedly when his father was coming home. Melinda told him that his father had gone away on a trip and would return when he could. Donald Jr., at age 4, had less understanding but absorbed his mother's distress and his brother's anxiety. Baby Melinda had no comprehension at all. Melinda continued to live in Britain for 2 years following Donald's defection, raising 3 children alone under conditions of social isolation, financial difficulty, and constant surveillance by MI5, which suspected she might have knowledge of other Soviet spies or might be in contact with Donald. She rarely left the flat except for necessary errands. She stopped attending church. She lost weight and appeared, according to neighbors, increasingly fragile and haunted. In September 1953, Melinda shocked British authorities by disappearing with her 3 children. She had told no one of her plans. She withdrew the children from their schools, packed a few belongings, and traveled by train to Switzerland. From Switzerland, she made contact with Soviet intelligence officers who had been waiting for her signal. She was transported with the children through Austria and Czechoslovakia to Moscow, where she was reunited with Donald. Melinda's decision to join Donald in Moscow was the subject of extensive speculation. Some observers believed she still loved him and could not bear the separation. Others believed Soviet intelligence had threatened or manipulated her. Still others believed she simply could not cope with raising 3 children alone under the circumstances and saw no future for herself or her children in Britain, where they would always be associated with betrayal and scandal. In interviews she gave years later to sympathetic journalists, Melinda said that she had chosen to join Donald because she believed her children needed their father and because she saw no viable life for herself or her children in Britain. She acknowledged that the decision was difficult and that she had doubts, but she felt trapped between impossible choices. Life in Moscow was profoundly difficult for the Maclean family. Soviet authorities provided Donald with an apartment in a building reserved for foreign communists and defectors, a gray concrete structure on the outskirts of Moscow with small rooms, thin walls, and unreliable heating. He received a modest salary for work as a consultant on British and American affairs for Soviet foreign policy institutes. The work was largely make-work, involving writing reports that were rarely read and attending meetings where his insights were politely acknowledged but rarely acted upon. Donald struggled with alcoholism and depression throughout his years in Moscow. He drank vodka primarily, beginning in the afternoons and continuing until he passed out in the evenings. His face became bloated and red. His hands trembled constantly. He aged rapidly, looking 10 years older than his actual age by his late 40s. Melinda struggled to adapt to Soviet society, despite having some facility with Russian that she gradually improved. She found the climate harsh, bitterly cold winters, brief springs, oppressive summer heat. She found the scarcity of consumer goods frustrating. She missed simple things from Britain and America: fresh vegetables, decent coffee, books in English, the ability to move freely without surveillance. She enrolled the children in Soviet schools where instruction was in Russian, a language none of them spoke well initially. The marriage deteriorated throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. Donald and Melinda quarreled frequently, sometimes violently when both had been drinking. Neighbors in their apartment building reported hearing shouting matches late at night, the crash of breaking dishes, doors slamming. The children grew up in an unstable household, caught between a mother who regretted her decision to come to Moscow and a father who was slowly destroying himself with alcohol. Burgess, the eldest son, attended Soviet schools and learned Russian fluently, though he spoke with an accent that marked him as foreign. Teachers praised his father as a hero who had sacrificed everything to serve the socialist cause, while classmates mocked his British accent and called him the English spy's son. He spent his 12th birthday watching his father collapse drunk at the kitchen table, unable to rise even when visiting Soviet officials arrived to discuss a research project. Donald Jr. struggled even more than his brother. He was 11 when the family arrived in Moscow and had clearer memories of life in Britain. He resented the move, resented his father for causing it, and became increasingly rebellious as a teenager. He began drinking at age 15, smoking at 16, and by his late teens had developed the same alcoholism that had destroyed his father. Melinda, the youngest, who had been only 5 months old when her father defected and who had no memory of England, was told by her mother that she was British, while her Soviet documents listed her as stateless. She grew up confused about her identity, belonging nowhere fully, speaking Russian with an accent and English with a different accent, never quite fitting in anywhere. In 1966, after 13 years in Moscow, Melinda made the decision to leave Donald and return to the West. She took the two younger children with her, Donald Jr., now 20, and Melinda, now 15, and settled initially in Switzerland before eventually moving to the United States. Burgess, who was then 21, chose to remain in Moscow with his father, having built a life there and perhaps feeling some loyalty to the man who had chosen ideology over family. The divorce was finalized in absentia in 1968. Court records indicate no contested issues, no arguments over property or custody. Donald and Melinda simply ended a marriage that had been effectively over for years. For the three Maclean children, the long-term consequences of their father's choices played out over decades in different ways. Burgess remained in Moscow, working as a translator and interpreter, maintaining a relationship with his father until Donald's death. He appeared to accept his father's political commitments, or at least to make peace with them. He married a Russian woman, had children of his own, and built what appeared from the outside to be a relatively stable life, though he rarely spoke publicly about his father and appeared to maintain emotional distance from questions about espionage and betrayal. Donald Jr., who left Moscow with his mother at age 20, struggled throughout his adult life with alcoholism and depression that seemed directly connected to the trauma of his childhood. He eventually settled in Britain and worked in journalism, writing primarily about Eastern European politics. In one of the few interviews he gave about his father, conducted in 1985, he said that he had spent most of his life trying to understand why his father had made the choices he made, and that he had concluded there was no satisfactory answer, that his father had been motivated by a combination of ideology, ego, and self-deception that even Donald himself probably never fully understood. Donald Jr. died in 1997 at age 51 from liver failure related to alcoholism. Melinda, the youngest, who left Moscow at age 15 with her mother, spent her adult life in the United States, working as a teacher. She married, had children, and appeared to build a relatively stable life, though she rarely spoke about her father and seemed to have largely compartmentalized that aspect of her history. In a brief statement she gave to a researcher in 1998, she said that her father was effectively a stranger to her, that she had no real memories of him from before the family moved to Moscow, and that her memories from Moscow were of a man who was usually drunk and always distant. In the years following his defection, Donald Maclean occasionally gave interviews to Soviet media outlets and to sympathetic Western journalists. In a 1970 interview with a British communist newspaper, he defended his espionage as ideologically motivated and morally justified. He claimed that he had been working for peace by ensuring that the Soviet Union had information that would help prevent Western aggression and nuclear war. He characterized himself not as a traitor, but as someone who had remained loyal to principles of international socialism that transcended national boundaries. He said that Britain and America were the real aggressors in the Cold War, and that his actions had been necessary to counter Western imperialism. These justifications rang hollow to most observers, particularly as documentation of Stalin's crimes became increasingly available, and as the Soviet Union's oppression of its own citizens and satellite states became undeniable. The idealistic communism that had attracted young men like Donald at Cambridge in the 1930s had been exposed as a brutal dictatorship that had killed millions through forced collectivization, show trials, purges, and the Gulag system. Yet Donald appeared never to publicly acknowledge doubt or regret about his political commitments. Whether this was genuine conviction or psychological necessity, an inability to confront the possibility that he had destroyed his life and his family for a cause that had proven to be a catastrophic lie, is impossible to determine with certainty. In private, according to accounts from people who knew him in Moscow, including other British defectors and Soviet colleagues, Donald was often melancholy and withdrawn. He would sit for hours in his apartment, drinking and staring out the window at the gray Moscow streets. He rarely spoke about his children who had left. When asked about his life in Britain, he would change the subject or pour another drink. Donald Maclean died in Moscow on March 6, 1983, at the age of 69, from heart failure related to decades of heavy drinking. He had lived in the Soviet Union for 32 years, more than half his adult life, in exile from his homeland and from most of his family. Soviet newspapers published obituaries praising him as a hero of the socialist cause who had sacrificed career and comfort in Britain to support the Soviet Union. British newspapers described him as a traitor whose espionage had damaged national security and whose defection had humiliated the British government and exposed catastrophic security failures. His funeral in Moscow was attended by a small group of Soviet officials, a few British expatriates and communist sympathizers, and his son Burgess. Melinda did not attend, nor did his other two children. His body was cremated, and his ashes were buried in Kuntsevo Cemetery on the outskirts of Moscow. The headstone is simple gray granite with his name and dates carved in both Russian and English. There are no epitaphs, no words attempting to explain or justify his life. The long-term assessment of Donald's espionage has evolved over decades as more information has been declassified from British, American, and Soviet archives. Intelligence historians now generally agree that Donald was one of the most damaging spies in British history. His access to atomic energy intelligence during the crucial period when the United States and Britain were developing atomic weapons, combined with his access to high-level diplomatic and strategic information throughout his career, allowed him to provide Soviet intelligence with material that significantly advanced Soviet weapons development and gave Soviet leaders detailed knowledge of Western strategic thinking during the early Cold War. A comprehensive damage assessment completed by British intelligence in 1955 and partially declassified in 2002 concluded that Donald had access to approximately 10,000 classified documents during his Foreign Office career, and that he likely passed information about several thousand of these to Soviet intelligence. The assessment noted that the most significant damage occurred during his Washington posting from 1944 to 1948, when his intelligence about the Manhattan Project and atomic energy policy provided the Soviets with information that shortened their atomic weapons development timeline. The question of why Donald did it, what motivated a man from his background with every advantage and opportunity to betray his country for 16 years, remains complex and contested among historians, psychologists, and intelligence researchers who have studied the case. The ideological explanation that Donald himself offered emphasized his commitment to communism formed at Cambridge in the 1930s and his belief that he was serving a higher cause than national loyalty. This explanation has validity in that Donald was genuinely attracted to communist ideology during a period when fascism appeared to threaten civilization and when liberal democracy seemed incapable of addressing economic depression and social inequality. However, psychological and personal factors were almost certainly also at play. Donald was a man who compartmentalized his life to an extraordinary degree, maintaining separate identities as a conventional British diplomat and as a Soviet spy for 16 years. This compartmentalization may have allowed him to avoid confronting the full implications of what he was doing, to tell himself that he was serving peace and progress while simultaneously betraying specific individuals who trusted him and potentially endangering lives through the intelligence he compromised. The intellectual satisfaction of being valued by his Soviet handlers, the sense of importance derived from operating at the center of global events with secret knowledge, and perhaps some element of rebellion against the rigid Presbyterian morality of his upbringing all likely played roles in sustaining his commitment to espionage, even as the ideological justifications became more difficult to maintain. The damage Donald caused extended far beyond the classified documents he compromised. His espionage and defection contributed to a crisis of confidence in British institutions that persisted throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The Foreign Office and intelligence services had to confront the reality that one of their own, a man from an impeccable family background, with outstanding credentials and a distinguished career, had been working for the enemy for 16 years without detection. Security procedures were completely overhauled, vetting processes were strengthened with more rigorous background checks and periodic reviews. A culture of suspicion developed within the services that made it difficult to operate effectively and that damaged morale for years. The special relationship between Britain and the United States was strained by revelations that Soviet spies had penetrated the highest levels of the British government. American officials questioned whether British security could be trusted with sensitive intelligence. Cooperation on intelligence matters was temporarily reduced. Rebuilding that trust required years of institutional reform and demonstrated reliability. The human cost was borne primarily by people who had no choice in any of it, and who bore no responsibility for Donald's decisions. Melinda Maclean, who married a man she believed to be a conventional diplomat and discovered she had married a Soviet spy, spent decades dealing with the aftermath. She endured social isolation in Britain, made the agonizing decision to join Donald in Moscow believing she had no viable alternative, suffered through 13 years of a deteriorating marriage in a foreign country under a repressive regime, and finally left, returning to the West to rebuild her life at age 48. She lived until 2010, dying at age 94 in New York, having outlived Donald by 27 years. In her final years, she declined all interview requests and refused to discuss her former husband, having apparently made peace with the past by simply refusing to engage with it. The 3 children grew up bearing a burden they did not choose and could not escape. Burgess spent his entire adult life in exile from his mother and siblings, maintaining loyalty to a father who was increasingly alcoholic and depressed. Donald Jr. struggled with addiction and depression that he attributed directly to the trauma of his childhood, dying in 1997 at age 51 from liver failure related to alcoholism. Melinda built a relatively stable life, but carried the weight of her family history, rarely speaking about her father, and seeming to have achieved peace primarily through emotional distance and compartmentalization. The question of responsibility in Donald's case involves multiple layers of agency and constraint. Donald made choices to commit espionage and to defect. He chose to approach or accept recruitment by Soviet intelligence. He chose to provide classified information over 16 years. He chose to flee Britain rather than face interrogation and prosecution. He chose to bring his family to Moscow, knowing the difficulties they would face. He bore responsibility for all of these choices. But he made those choices within contexts that shaped what options appeared available and what justifications seemed plausible. He was recruited during a period when fascism appeared to be an existential threat and when communism appeared to many idealistic young people as the only viable alternative. He operated during a war when Britain and the Soviet Union were allies, which made his rationalization easier. He defected at a moment when he faced imminent arrest, when flight appeared to be his only option to avoid prosecution and imprisonment. These contextual factors do not absolve him of responsibility, but they complicate simple moral judgments. Was Donald a villain who betrayed his country for ideology and ego, causing enormous damage to national security and destroying his own family? Yes. Was he also a human being shaped by historical circumstances, recruited at a vulnerable moment, trapped in commitments he could not easily escape, and ultimately destroyed by his own choices? Also, yes, both things can be true simultaneously, and the gap between them, the space where simple judgments fail and moral complexity resides, is where the real human story exists. Donald Maclean was 38 when he fled Britain on the ferry to Saint-Malo, leaving behind a wife and 3 young children who would spend the rest of their lives dealing with consequences they did not deserve. He was 69 when he died in Moscow, having lived 32 years in exile, having lost his marriage, his relationship with 2 of his 3 children, and any possibility of returning to his homeland. And in between, he provided Soviet intelligence with classified information that advanced Soviet weapons development and strategic planning, damaged British and American national security, and contributed to Cold War tensions that threatened the world with nuclear annihilation. The photograph that appeared in British newspapers after his defection was announced showed Donald in his Foreign Office years, a well-dressed man in his 30s with a serious expression, looking directly at the camera, appearing entirely conventional. There was nothing in the image that suggested he was living a double life or that he would eventually flee to Moscow and die in exile. That ordinariness is perhaps what makes his case most unsettling. Espionage and betrayal can look, in frozen moments captured on film, exactly like everything else.